In a landmark decision, the U.S. Supreme Court said that former presidents have absolute immunity from prosecution for official acts, but no immunity for unofficial acts. The ruling comes as federal prosecutors push for a case against Donald Trump for allegedly plotting to overturn his 2020 presidential election loss. Observers say this decision also holds relevance for African nations, where the question of presidential immunity remains a contentious issue. Joining us in the studio for more insight is Dr. Kenneth Mwenda, Extraordinary Professor of Law at the University of Western Cape, South Africa. Professor Mwenda, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Linord.
Help us understand immunity. We've heard of diplomatic immunity, now we're talking about presidential immunity, yet we saw Jacob Zuma not long ago being prosecuted. So what is presidential immunity, really?
The fundamental starting point is the rule of law, that nobody is above the law, including a president. However, there are some exceptions within the law which permit for immunity, and this is under international law. So what the U.S. Supreme Court has done was simply to replicate the norms of international law and apply them to the U.S. context, because the U.S. Constitution is silent on presidential immunity. In 1982, there was the case of Nixon versus Fitzgerald, but that case focused on civil liability and said that, the president is not liable for civil damages in carrying out his official functions. Now, the ruling that has just been passed by the Supreme Court deals with criminal liability, which is different prosecution for. And the ruling, there were two strands that came out there. One is that a president or a former sitting president cannot be prosecuted for carrying out what is known as the core constitutional, functions of the office, which are within his mandate. The words they used were conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. If he has that, you cannot prosecute him when he was carrying out. The other aspect is other official functions, which are not in the Constitution, but other official functions. He has what is known as presumptive immunity. So the other one is absolute immunity, the latter is presumptive immunity. Very
tricky there. Yeah. So how have African countries handled presidential immunity? We've seen cases of corruptions in some countries, and then we've seen that some presidents were not prosecuted, but others were for various reasons. So talk to us about the African context.
In particular, I think if we look at South Africa, the South African Constitution is another interesting piece of legislation. It does not provide for presidential immunity. So that is why you saw President Zuma being prosecuted. Other African countries have sort of had explicit spelled out provisions in the Constitution which provide for that immunity. For example, Zambia, Malawi, they have that. However, that immunity can be waived if there is a certain requisite number of parliamentary sort of votes which say we're going to waive your immunity and we'll prosecute you after leaving office. That can be done. But the whole idea is not to abuse the due process of the law. That can only be triggered in exceptional circumstances, and in the ideal case, the Constitution should spell out under what circumstances immunity can be waived. Otherwise, it will be, just people going after each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what mechanisms then exist to ensure accountability for president who may abuse immunity?
At the international level, there is the ICC, the International Criminal Court, where a president can still be dragged for certain and prosecuted for committing certain crimes if the state where he was president is a party to the ICC convention. Okay. That can be done. So it doesn't mean that when you have this immunity, then you can act capriciously and do whatever you want. But even in the US, I would like to believe that the reasoning that the US Supreme Court has come up with, I know there are reservations that now they are saying that the president can do whatever he wants. No, you cannot act capriciously. There are certain norms of the common law under Article 38 of the ICJ Convention, which spells out some of the sources of the law, which the ICJ looks at, International Court of Justice. We look at what we call principles of civilized nations. What are they doing elsewhere in the common law jurisdiction? US is a common law jurisdiction. They are not an island. So you have to look at other common law jurisdictions and get persuasive precedents from there of how you can handle this.
Wow, that was clear. Yeah. Thank you.
And I also wanted to add that, in addition, we shouldn't forget that in the US, nothing has been spelled out by the Supreme Court yet on the grounds upon which immunity can be waived. We have that in other jurisdictions. In the US, it hasn't been discussed yet. So it will be an interesting discussion.
Very interesting indeed. Yeah. Professor Mwenda, thank you so much.
You're most welcome.